Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, the top 10 crazy ways that Finland fought off Soviet domination. The Winter War began in November 1939 when the Soviets invaded Finland, seeking to claim Finnish territory. With overwhelming number advantages in men and firepower, the Soviets were expecting victory in a couple of weeks. Instead, the conflict went on for 3 months, with the Soviet soldiers taking casualties at a rate 5 times to that of the Finnish forces. While Finland ultimately agreed to sign 11% of its land over to the Soviets in the peace treaty that ended the war, Finland retained its sovereignty and demonstrated that it was no easy target. Nikita Khrushchev characterized the advantages the Soviets had, noting, "But on these most favorable terms, we could only win through huge difficulties and incredibly great losses. In fact, this victory was a moral defeat." So how did tiny Finland, dramatically outgunned and outmanned with soldiers who looked like they'd be more at home in Santa's workshop than on the battlefield, give the Soviets so much more of a fight than they anticipated? Well, in the video today, we're looking at the 10 ingenious ways the Finnish forces fought off the Soviets to deliver this moral defeat. Number 10. They ate well and made sure the Soviets didn't. The Winter War certainly proved the old saying that an army marches on its stomach. Finnish soldiers did pretty well in the food department. The Lotusfard, an organization of Finnish women who supported the war effort, managed catering efforts for the troops. Volunteers staffed small mobile field kitchens, sometimes pulled on sleds to provide hot meals to their soldiers. Almost every unit had its own field kitchen, staffed with personnel who accompanied the soldiers everywhere. Caterers even carried their own firearms when their units were in combat zones. Additionally, local chapters of the organization operated baking units, which produced 200,000 kilograms of bread per day for the Finnish troops. Mindful of the value of a hot meal and a full stomach, Finnish soldiers worked diligently to deny the same to their Soviet opposition. Finnish soldiers targeted the much bulkier field kitchens for attack, depriving their adversaries of the sustenance of hot food, and this hurt morale. Hungry Soviet soldiers were responsible for one of the war's oddest episodes, a battle that came to be known as the Sausage War. The Soviets launched a surprise nighttime attack on Finnish artillery and supply columns, which were very lightly defended at the time. The initial attack, it was successful, but lost momentum when starving Soviet soldiers spotted bubbling pots of sausage soup that the Finnish had abandoned as they fled. As the Soviets tucked into the hot stew, the Finns regrouped, halting the Red Army's advance and killing over 100 Soviet soldiers, some of whom died with bits of sausage still in their mouths. Number 9. They used and coined the term Molotov cocktails to neutralize Soviet tanks. The invading Soviet army had 100 times more tanks than the Finns, who had less than 40 tanks, some of which were totally obsolete. The Finns also didn't have much anti-tank artillery at their disposal. What they did have was the ingenuity to use simple materials to negate the Soviet tank advantage. They built improvised explosive devices using a bottle with some flammable material inside and a rag as a fuse. When this rag was lit and the bottle was thrown, it would ignite the combustible contents upon impact. The tanks of the era had ventilation hatches, and when these flammable bottles were chucked into them, the fire, smoke, and heat they created within the confined environment of the tank drove the soldiers outside, where the Finnish forces could face them on a more even footing. While this type of device had been used in previous conflicts, the Winter War is when it became known as the Molotov cocktail. It was named derisively after the Russian Commissar of Foreign Affairs, who the Finns blamed for starting the Winter War. At the outset of the war, the Soviets blanketed bombs and incendiaries on Finland's capital Helsinki. When Finnish news sources reported these attacks, Molotov denied them and said that the Soviets were merely delivering food aid to starving Finns. The Finns, who, well, they knew this wasn't the case, began referring to multiple incendiary devices as Molotov breadbaskets. When the Finns started deploying their anti-tank bottle bombs, they dubbed them Molotov cocktails, saying they were serving up a drink to pair with the Soviet breadbaskets. Number 8. They had the White Death. Well, what is the White Death, you might be asking? Well, a better question would actually be, who was the White Death? The answer would be pretty surprising. Prior to the war, if you encountered Simo Häyhä, he probably wouldn't strike you as someone who warranted a fearsome nickname. An unassuming Finnish farmer, Häyhä stood only 5'1" and was in his mid-30s when the war broke out. Nonetheless, he managed to become the most prolific sniper in military history, reportedly killing 505 Soviet soldiers during the 3-month duration of the Winter War. Häyhä had enjoyed hunting as a hobby before the war, and his exceptional marksmanship as a sniper quickly became infamous among the terrified Soviet forces, who called him the White Death. This was probably because of the winter white coat and hood that he wore in order to camouflage himself. He did his very best to blend into the frozen landscape, preferring iron sights for his gun to avoid having the sun's glare reveal his position, and chewing snow to prevent his warm breath from being seen. While the Soviets tried numerous times to take Haya out, even when they finally succeeded in shooting him in the head, the Soviets could not stop the White Death. The day the Winter War ended, Haya emerged from a coma and was cheered as a national hero. Despite his exceptional performance as a sniper, Haya remained modest, saying, "I did what was asked as well as I could. Finland wouldn't exist if everyone hadn't done the same." Number 7. They had saunas. Pretty surprising, isn't it, having saunas in front-line combat? I mean, the idea might seem ludicrous at first glance, but saunas are an integral part of Finnish culture. In Finland, saunas outnumber households by a ratio of more than 2-1, and 99% of Finns visit a sauna at least once a week. Finnish soldiers, they were absolutely willing to fight to the death to defend their homeland, but they certainly weren't going to do it without saunas. Every 2 or 3 days, if combat conditions permitted, each Finnish soldier was scheduled for a turn on one of the frontline saunas. In addition to utilizing the village saunas that are a constant across Finland, Finnish troops had mobile saunas for themselves and their equipment. In addition to providing an obvious morale boost and a reminder of the culture that they were fighting for, the saunas were useful in preventing frostbite and killing bacteria, which reduced the incidence of disease. Number 6. They divided and conquered. In the Finnish language, moti means a bundle of firewood. During the Winter War, this word took on a new meaning as Finnish troops, greatly outnumbered by their Soviet counterparts, sought to divide Soviet units into isolated pockets called moti, which could then be surrounded and dealt with individually by Finnish soldiers. As one German military liaison to the Finns summarized it, Finnish tactics aim to penetrate the front of the enemy, to separate the enemy's strong points from each other, to cut off these strong points completely from all arteries of supply, and to encircle them. The moti strategy was abetted by the Soviets' use of heavy equipment. Large mechanized Soviet convoys were forced to travel in large columns across Finland's few major roadways. This left them vulnerable to ambushes from more nimble Finnish forces, who sometimes felled trees to separate Soviet convoys into more manageable moti. Once they were divided into pockets, the Finns were able to starve Soviet soldiers of supplies, including food, while launching occasional attacks, ultimately defeating these small groups and claiming their artillery. This tactic was effectively deployed in the Battle of Suomussalmi, where Finnish troops triumphed. Number 5. They used psychological warfare. Because they could never overcome the Soviet advantage in sheer volume of manpower, Finnish troops knew that they needed to demoralize the opposition. Finnish tactics focused on keeping the Soviet troops off balance, depriving them of any relief from the misery of war, and ensuring a constant state of fear amongst Soviet troops. In addition to the use of improvised explosives, snipers scattered throughout the wilderness, and the moti strategy, the Finnish employed other tactics to strike terror into the heart of their enemies. Much of the territory abandoned by Finnish troops was booby-trapped with bombs and mines, meaning a constant state of anxiety and a slow pace were features of any Soviet advance. Additionally, the retreating Finns destroyed civilian shelters as they left, denying the Soviets a place to rest. During the war, Soviet casualties were heavy, and on occasion Finnish forces propped up the frozen dead bodies of Soviet troops as a warning to their comrades. If the sight of the bodies of their fellow soldiers wasn't enough to keep Soviet soldiers awake at night, the ambush night attacks launched by the Finns ensured that sleeplessness was a constant for the Soviet forces, leading to diminished morale, lowered immunity to disease and frostbite, and duller reflexes. The presence of Finnish snipers meant that bonfires were also a very risky proposition, so most Soviet forces endured the long, cold winter nights with little relief from the frigid air. The Finnish also dropped leaflets from the air over the Soviet forces, offering cash payments for weapons and surrender, and depicting Soviet soldiers enjoying their lives post-surrender. Others mocked Soviet leadership and highlighted the gruesome losses that the Soviets had suffered during their war with Finland. Number 4. They used reindeer and sleds. While the Soviets relied on tanks to cover ground, Finnish defense forces used reindeer, pack horses, and sleds for transport. While this was largely a matter of necessity, the Finns did not have access to many tanks, it was also a much better method of traversing Finland's harsh winter terrain. Special deep snow horse-drawn sleighs called akios were used, demonstrating usefulness well beyond getting to grandmother's house. Akios were used to transport the wounded, haul munitions, and even as firing platforms for machine gunners. The sleighs were pulled by pack horses, and particularly in Finland's frigid Lapland region, by reindeer. Most of these animals had been repurposed from logging and farming operations and were used to pulling heavy loads in sub-zero temperatures. Using multiple reindeer, a sleigh could haul 650 pounds of gear, and the reindeer had the stamina to pull this weight for up to 8 hours at a time. In addition to being able to navigate well off-road, the sleighs offered another major advantage over the tanks, and that would be stealth. By not employing motorized convoys, Finnish soldiers were able to stay quiet, retaining the element of surprise when challenging their Soviet counterparts. During World War II, the Soviets, having learned from the Winter War, would develop their own reindeer units as part of their military strategy. Number 3. Finnish soldiers knew the terrain, and they knew how to navigate it. While they were outnumbered and outgunned, the Finnish troops did have the home field advantage, which they absolutely maximized. The Finns viewed the winter not as an impediment, but as an ally in defending their country. While almost all Finnish soldiers were experienced skiers, the Soviets lacked both decent skis. When Finnish soldiers captured Soviet skis, they employed them as firewood because of their inferior construction, and for the most part, they also lacked skiing ability. As winter began to intensify, Finnish soldiers were able to maintain excellent mobility through skiing, including over frozen lakes and rivers, able to launch ambush attacks on Soviet forces before gliding off into the woods. Because of their familiarity with the terrain, Finnish soldiers were also able to effectively launch nighttime raids on Soviet units. In addition to further depressing Soviet morale through these raids, the ability to navigate was a significant advantage because of the lack of daylight during most of the day during winter in Finland. Number 2. They dressed for success. The winter of 1939 was a very cold one in Finland, with temperatures hitting minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit on multiple occasions. While both sides anticipated the frigid conditions, the Finnish soldiers were aided by their clothing, while the Soviets were hampered by their uniforms. Finnish troops dressed in layers, generally wearing their own warm long underwear and sweaters under their uniforms, removing layers as needed in order to avoid excessive sweating while cross-country skiing. They also wore lightweight white snow capes over their uniforms, helping them to blend into the snow. In contrast, the Soviets wore khaki uniforms and utilized army green tanks, making them stand out even more prominently against the snow, providing unintentional assistance to the Finnish snipers. Number 1. They had sisu. This is a Finnish word that lacks a precise English equivalent, but it means a certain kind of resilience, grit, and a strength of purpose, particularly when confronted with adversity. The characteristic predates the Winter War by hundreds of years, long having been a central tenet of Finnish culture. It's the ability to persevere where others might give up. Sisu influenced all of the other aspects of Finland's ability to force a stalemate during the Winter War. Their soldiers were cowed by the Soviets' advantages in numbers and firepower. They maximized their few advantages, they developed novel tactics to dull the impact of the Soviet strengths, and an understated, small-statured farmer became one of the most lethal military snipers in history. While the Soviets had significant military advantages at the conflict's outset, by the end they undoubtedly understood that they had failed to account for the Finns' sisu when they had planned for a quick and easy conquest. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Do not forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also check out my new channel. It's called Biographics. We do biographies of notable people from history as well as the present day. So please do check that out. There's a link in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.